I've been getting questions over the last couple of years all about how I do my editing, and I figured I would go ahead and just make a little tutorial. This isn't going to show everything, but it should give a broad idea of some of the most common things that I use. The things we're going to be covering in this video are tracking, which are going to include motion tracking and 3D camera tracking. We're also going to include various ways of masking an object, which is going to include rotoscoping, it's going to include the pen tool, and then Luma and alpha matting. So right off the bat, we can see I have a Premiere Pro project. If you're going to be using Premiere and After Effects in conjunction with one another, you want to make sure you have the same version. So this is 2023. I also have After Effects 2023 that I'm using. Okay, so right off the bat, we can see I have the footage layer here, and this is going to be our background Arma footage. And then on top of that, we have a text layer, which in this case just says push and track text. So in order to get started, we're going to go ahead and bring these into After Effects. The way we're going to do that is select both the text layer and the footage layer, right click, and we're going to click replace with After Effects composition. Once again, if you don't see this, make sure you have both the same versions installed. So if you have 2023, make sure you have that for After Effects. If you're using an earlier version, make sure it's the same one. Okay, upon doing that, you'll notice that this layer now turns kind of like a different color. In this case, it's like a pinkish red, and it also creates a linked comp. So once I'm in here, you'll notice that the text has no shadow. One thing I'll do to add that is click on the text, click layer, layer style, drop shadow, and then in the drop shadow settings, the opacity, I'll just turn that to 50, and that's normally what I will do for that. I don't touch it after that. So in order to get started with motion tracking, what we're going to need is a null layer. So we can either right click down here, or we can click layer up here. Either way, we're going to click new, null object, and you'll see it's just this little kind of red box that's in the middle here. In order to start motion tracking, we're going to select our text layer and come over here to the tracker panel. If at any time during this video you see me click on something but you don't see it yourself, go over here to the window tab, click that, and then make sure you have it checked on tracker down here, and just make sure that's turned on. So click on the text layer, we're gonna click track motion. That's gonna create a new kind of tab up here, the layer tab, that we're gonna be looking specifically at that. So you can see it's just me walking, and we wanna track this to the back of the character's head. Now, one thing that's really important to note before you start motion tracking is you wanna put the area that we're tracking, you want it to be the kind of the anchor point of the text. So for example, if we want this essentially like glued to this character's head, we don't want to track like his pants, like we don't want to track like the belt or his arm or something like that. Like we want it to basically be the area that we want the movement to be coming from. I should also say I don't have any formal background in this. This is all just years of editing and YouTube tutorials and whatnot. But the basic idea is you have this box right here. If you click inside the box, you can move it around. You'll have two layers here. You'll have a little dot, and you'll have this inner box and outer one. So this inner box is essentially what pixels it's going to be looking to kind of be tracking. And this outer box is where it's going to be searching. So let's go ahead and pick a area that we want to track. Now this works the best when we have areas of higher contrast. So various layers. I mean, we could track like this box if we wanted to, or maybe this kind of back piece right here, maybe this little button, something like that. We're just going to pick, let's go with that button. So we want the area that we're going to be looking at to be roughly this size, but we know he's going to be moving around. So we're going to make the search area a little bit bigger. So or maybe something like that. We can go ahead over here and just click the play button. Now I'm just going to hit play and just see what happens. Okay. So pretty much immediately you can see it messes up right there. It kind of flies off to the wrong side. So this is just two objects that look similar. It's looking in this area, and so it thinks it's that. We can just either move it back manually, or if we didn't want to do that, we can go in here and we can delete that specific point, and then it'll just interpolate that frame. So this brings up a good point. If you have a difficult time motion tracking, and let's say you're playing this and it's just kind of flying all over the place, you may have to do some manual tracking, like essentially doing it by hand. And you can use page up and page down to scrub through the footage. And so this is extremely tedious, but sometimes you kind of have to do it. Page down and essentially move it to where it should be, page down, and you can just do frame by frame by frame. Now if you're thinking, wow, that's way too tedious, you can also skip a couple frames. Now if you have an object that's moving all over the place, you're probably going to want to track each frame, but an example like this, you could skip a couple frames, like what was that, 3 or 4, move it down there, and then you'll see it'll interpolate that, creates little track points based off of where it thinks it should be. I'm going to go ahead and track the rest of this, and then we can see how it turns out. So once you're done with that, what we're going to do is we're going to go up here to edit target. We're going to make sure it's applied to the null. We want it to be going to the null layer. We don't want it going straight to the text layer, and there's a reason for that. Track type, I use track type transform. In this case, we want it to apply to the transform values, aka the position values. And so we want it to be set to transform. So we're going to confirm motion target null 1 and click apply. It's going to ask which dimensions you want. We want X and Y, so we're going to press OK. And now you come out here and you think, what the hell? It's not working. Well, the reason for that is because we have to essentially link these two things together. You could use this little pick a whip tool. And so you can left click on the text and we want to parent it to the null. You can drag and drop it over like that. Or you can just come over here and select the layer. Click this null 1. If you don't see this down here, hit this toggle switch mode. If you see something like this that looks a little different, there's 2 different modes. So you just toggle between those 2. I normally am in this mode. And we're going to move the text kind of where we want it. So we want, this is the anchor point right here in the middle. So that's dead center. We want it kind of lined up like that. We can hide our null layer. Now let's take a look. Okay, so this turned out looking good. If at any point there are some errors, like let's say maybe you missed a spot where it kind of glitched out and went whatever, you can go back into the layer. Let's say, I don't know, let's say one of these frames, let's say this frame was messed up. We can delete it or fix it or do whatever we want. Click apply again. And then once we're back into the composition layer, it will have fixed that. So if you had something where it went crazy, you can delete it and then reset it like that. That's a very basic one. There are other different modes you can do with the rotation and the scale and stuff, but this is what I use the most often. So next we're going to take a look at camera tracking. This is a little bit different. Instead of you selecting a point, essentially the software will select a bunch of various points and try to create a 3D camera that's moving through this 3D space, aka the footage. Okay, so once again, we're going to select our footage layer. Now instead of clicking track motion, we're going to do track camera. And you'll notice it is going to have this banner. It says analyzing background, and essentially it's going to start. You'll see a frame counter up here. So if we kind of just scrub through, we can see that there are some track points, and it looks like it did overall a pretty decent job. Not stellar, but pretty good. The camera tracker is meant for cameras. It's not really intended for video games. It doesn't really know exactly what it's looking at. This is one of those things that kind of, it doesn't always work out in your favor. Now, one of the things you can do, this is just the standard track. If this turned out looking really bad, you can click advanced and you can do a detailed analysis. This is going to take a little bit longer, but most of the time it will give you a better result. Let me go ahead and try it and see what happens. Okay, so we just did the advanced method and you can see it got us a little bit better results. So I think we're going to go ahead and stick with this. Now that we have these track points, let's go ahead and get a target so we can put the text on the side of this tank. We want it on the side of the tank, so we're going to grab one of these. So we're going to click, we're going to right click, and I like to do create solid in camera. And the reason I like to do this is so we can see the solid and we can see how it moves in the space. We can see it looks as though it's tracked pretty good to the side of that tank. So now what we can do with that is we can take our text layer, and over here on the left side, you'll notice that it has this 3D box kind of thing. This is how you determine if an object is a 3D object. So to create this text as a 3D object, we're going to click it. Now you can see it's been placed into the shot, not exactly where we want it. If we want to essentially make it have that same conditions or have it the same effects that that box has, we can select it. We're going to hold left shift. We're going to use the pick a whip. We're going to drag and drop. And so now you notice the text, it has the same essentially transform position values and stuff like that this box does. Now specifically holding shift will make it the same size and everything. If we had just paired the two together like that, it doesn't work the same way and match them like that. Now we can either hide the box or get rid of it, whatever. And you'll notice the text is a little small, so we'll make it a bit bigger. There you go. You can notice it looks like it needs to be twisted just a little bit. This is how you're going to affect what it looks like in 3D space. And once again, that looks pretty good. You know, again, if you're not getting great results on this, a lot of the times it's just the footage is just not really meant for camera tracking. So like if you're playing Call of Duty and then you're like whipping the camera around and stuff like that, it's going to be pretty hard for it to get a great track. Okay, next thing we're on to is rotoscoping. And rotoscoping is a fun one because if you've done it, you know how painful it can be. So let's say we want this text to kind of be like it's on the wall or something like that. We can maybe put the drop shadow a little bit more of a distance. Now we have this dude who decides he wants to walk straight through the footage, and we got to make it look like this text is behind him. To save you from doing more work than you have to, let me encourage you to only rotoscope the areas that you need to. So for example, it doesn't make any sense to start like right here or something because he's not interfering with any of the graphics. So we're going to start right here. That'll be the first frame that we do. So the way we can do this is we want to duplicate the footage layer because we want the rotoscope footage to be on top of the text. So to duplicate it, we're going to do left Control D. Now we don't need all this extra footage here on the left side. So with the kind of timeline right where we want it to be, we're going to do left control, left shift, and D, which is going to splice the footage there. So we don't need this front layer, so we can delete that. And then same thing here in the back. So we're going to select it, left control, left shift, D, and then delete that footage. So let's go ahead and put it on top of our text layer, and let's double click on it. So now we have its own separate layer, and we're going to click this tool up here. This is the rotoscoping brush tool, or roto brush tool, whatever you want to call it. You can see that it's just kind of a green circle right now. Now if we hold left control and then we hold left click, if we move the mouse up and down, we can make this brush bigger or smaller. We can see it's green right here. If I hold left alt, now it's in the subtract mode. So this is going to be useful once we start going. Let's go ahead and start rotoscoping. So in order to do that, we're going to find our subject. We're going to get an appropriate brush size, and then we're just going to start kind of left clicking like a little bit of an outline of the area. You know, how much of his body actually interferes with the text? Well, it's mostly just his head, so it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to do his legs there. So we're really just going to focus on the upper body. And you can see it kind of missed the glasses there, so we'll do that to include it. A little bit of the ear got cut off there. Now, if we want to scrub, just like I was saying earlier, we can use page up and page down to scrub forward and backwards. Now, I intentionally picked a nice contrasty background to make it easier on myself. You're not always going to have this easy of a time. So right along here, you can see along the window there that the glasses start to get kind of messed up. So let's go through, and in this case, we're just going to go each frame and correct what goes missing. This is a good example of sometimes it can overcorrect. So just use left alt and cut that area out. Same thing here with the chin, kind of cut that out. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this, but I think you guys get the idea. Oh, one thing to note, you'll notice that the footage will sometimes kind of become unaligned like this. If you want to just quickly move it over, hold spacebar, and then use left click, and you can move the footage over. You get the little hand tool, and then just release spacebar to go back to the roto brush. Okay, so now we are done, and this is roughly what it looks like. If we want to see just where the area is, we can see we have him cut out, or we can look at it this way. Essentially the way this works is it looks for the further pixels, and it looks to constantly be correcting itself, which is called propagation. If we don't want it to do that anymore, because it can get sometimes annoying and it can undo some of the work that you've done, we want to hit the freeze button. Okay, so now it's frozen. We can go back to the composition layer, and it's done a pretty good job. So now we have him in front. We can see certain areas, kind of like on the back of the head there, that it looks like it might have gotten a little bit of the spillover, but that's okay because now we can correct it. So in the effects control area, we can control, these are mostly the biggest things that we're going to be messing around with. Feather, this is just going to be how soft your edges are, and we'll correct it. So we could do, let's say it's normally on 5, so let's say we do 10. It softens it up a little bit, but we can still see some of that spill over there. I don't typically mess with the contrast all that much. Shift edge, though, I will mess with. And so we can bring that in a little bit by giving it a negative value. And we can see it kind of deletes some of those outside pixels, or kind of brings it in, shoves it in a little bit. Chatter is just about smoothing out rougher edges. So if you have footage that's very jaggedy or something like that, and you kind of want it to be rounded out, you can do the reduce chatter, and that can sometimes help a little bit. So, but yeah, overall, I think this turned out looking pretty good. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so for this last one, I kind of wanted to combine a bit of everything that I've showed off so far, and show you kind of how you can use them all together. Let's take a look at the footage first, and let's kind of think about what we want to do with it. So we have just some footage of a background here, and we could see that the camera is moving around a bit. Let's say for this shot, we want to take this text layer and we want to have it come up kind of from behind the mountains and show itself maybe like that. So first off, we're going to need to track the footage because we want the text to be with the footage. And then we're going to have to find a way to essentially put the text behind all this foliage and stuff because we want it to be back behind the mountain. So first off, we could do our first method, which is by using a motion track. And we could pick something like maybe this tree right here. It's kind of off in the distance. And we could motion track that. So now that we have this motion tracked, we can see we have the text, it moves around with the footage, but we could also do something like a camera track. So let's try that and see how that looks. So we could create a solid and we could have it tracked like that. And as you can see, we kind of have two different ways that we could do this. So next, let's animate the text, and we want it to be moving up from behind the mountain. So let's go, I normally do 12 to 15 frames. So we want the final position of the text to be here. So we're going to create a position keyframe, and we want the text to be down behind the mountain. So we're going to move it right there. If you select your two keyframes and press F9 on your keyboard, you can give them a little more of an ease in, ease out, and it kind of gives it more of a natural speed up, slow down kind of movement. So the first method we could use is the most simple, it's the most generic, it's the pen tool. So if we wanted to duplicate the footage by using left control D and bring it up to the top, what we could do is come up here to the pen tool and we could essentially create an outline and just cut this all out manually. Okay, so we'll bring it around the sides like that so it's fully hiding everything else. And let's take a look. Wow, it looks awful. So the reason for that is because this isn't tracked to anything. It's just moving on its own. We could see that it's actually not moving at all is what it's doing. If we wanted it to be tracked to this layer, click this down arrow, click the mask, select the mask, and now we can see we can track the mask itself. So in this case, we're going to do the position, scale, and rotation. Actually, I may as well just do the position and rotation because we know the camera's not moving forward at all. And we can click play. And we can see it will now slowly, painstakingly go through and try and track this mask to the footage. This is probably the least effective way of doing this. I would not recommend doing it this way. We can see that with the footage, I mean, it does an okay job, but it starts to slip off there and we'd have to go through each frame and we'd have to track it that way. Now, another method is alpha and Luma matting. So what is alpha and Luma matting? So let's create a new layer. And let's create a solid and let's make it white. Okay, so now we can hide this, but with it still selected, make sure it's still selected that we're actually using the white solid. We can then go through and use the pen tool and we can redraw our line here. Okay, I finished creating the mask. So now let's turn this back on and we can see that we have this white layer. Now, once again, I didn't do a great job around the edges, but it's fine for this purpose. So now what we can do is we can take this layer and we can essentially tell the text layer to only be visible either when it's inside this layer or behind it or when it's outside of it. And there's two ways we can do that. When you have these two objects and you want to do some form of matting, the one that you select is the one that you want to be visible. So in this case, we want to select our text layer and we want to mat it with the white solid. So right now we have it set to where the text is visible when it's within that white solid. But if we go forward, you'll see it starts to disappear. Once again, we want it to be the opposite though. So we're going to click next to it, this button, which is going to invert it. So now when we look at it, we'll see the text is visible behind that. But you'll notice still that the mask is not perfectly tracked. Well, because we used a solid, what we can do is we can parent it to either the null in this case. Let's say you did a track like that, you could parent it to the null. If you wanted it to be with the track solid, you would have to make it a 3D layer and then you would have to parent it. Just once again, the same way that we use the text, you'd have to create it as a 3D layer. You'd have to do that shift left click thing, make it the same size, give it the same values, and then you would do this where you would either use the alpha or the luminance, and then sometimes you may have to invert it. It's a little complicated. I'm trying to make it as not complicated as possible, but until you start playing around with it, it's kind of difficult to make sense of it. Well, if we can use luminance, aka light value, well then why not just use the brightest thing here, which is the sky. Duplicate our footage, and we're gonna bring it up on top, and we're going to either come to the effects and presets thing right here, or right click it and do effect, color correction, and tint, which is by default going to make it black and white as an image, and we want to keep it that way. So then we're going to type in an effect called curves, and we're going to apply that to our layer. Now the idea with this is we want to make the darkest part essentially black, and we want to make the brightest part essentially white. So I normally start with the darkest part. So you can see as we lower this curve, bring this to the right, that all our ground gets a lot darker. It essentially turns it to black. And then as I bring this over to the left, our white value here, you'll see the sky turns to white. Now it's not perfect. You can see that there's some areas that like here on the ground. So again, we're going to select the text, select that top footage. And in this case, we're going to use luminance value. So we want that little sun logo, and we can see it's visible here where we don't want it to be. So we're going to click the invert once again. And now we have it hidden behind. If you want to clean something up like this, you could always select your footage layer and you can either drag the black back a bit or you can drag the white back a little bit. But notice that, yeah, you'll start to get things like this where it'll start to spill over. So another way you can fix that is just by applying just a tiny bit of a blur. So if we go to right click, effect, blur and sharpen, and then let's just do say a fast box blur and then just give it like a little bit. That may be even too much. We can use a different blur, but you can see you can kind of soften up the edges. Yeah, so let's say we're satisfied with this. You'll notice right here, for example, where it's some of the brighter footage, that you can see the text kind of leaking through. And one of the ways you can touch this up is essentially just by hiding it using, let's say we duplicate this bottom footage layer put it on top, and then just create a simple mask right here that we know footage will be behind. We can do something like that. It gives a pretty good look, and you get a lot of detail there. Once again, I mean, these are a little jagged here. I might touch that up, but you can get a lot of detail, and because it's using the light values, this is where you can get some really cool effects. I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I can almost guarantee I didn't touch on everything. I always do these unscripted. So as always, if there are questions, which I'm sure there will be some, please do leave them in the comments, and I will try to address them as quickly as I can and with as much detail as I can. Yeah, hopefully this has been helpful, and have a good one.